Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Naghma. Joining me is Professor Pant. This week we will look at External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar's visit to the US and his speech at the UNGA, the relationship between India and the US, India and China, and a lot more on this episode of the Ideas Factory. A very warm welcome to you, Harsh. And I would like to begin with our External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar's visit to the United States, his speech at the UNGA, also his very, very interesting and very straightforward dig at the American media, the popular media there, and putting forth India's stand on multiple pressing issues that the world is facing, including reform at the UN, including a new concept of multilateralism. He also raised questions on Biden administration's approval of a sustenance package to Pakistan on F-16 and said that this relationship has not served either of these two nations very well. India also received praise from France, from Macron, also received praise from Lavrov, and we've also seen that Lavrov backed India for a permanent seat and referred to India as a key international actor. So it was a very interesting speech there, and S. Jaishankar did not mince words in putting forth what India stands for now. Your comments and your analysis of that speech.
This was an interesting General Assembly session for India because India was very proactive in terms of reaching out to various stakeholders on global governance. And India was also there in the United Nations, making a broader point about the future of the United Nations as the fulcrum of global multilateral order. And I think a point that India has been repeatedly making, that ultimately, if India does not have a place in the Security Council, then it's the credibility of the United Nations that suffers more than anything else. So I think what Dr. Jaishankar did perhaps was to lay out a very proactive Indian diplomatic agenda in front of the UN, and also made it clear that India continues to remain open when it comes to shouldering its global responsibilities. And I think the juxtaposition that that I think he wanted to make very clear was that, look, there are members of the UN Security Council that don't uphold the UN Charter in letter and as well as in its spirit. But whereas India is there, which is not a permanent member of the UNSC, and still, if you look at India's contributions to global governance, to regional and global order, they remain highly significant. And I think that's what he was mentioning, whether it was in terms of vaccine Maitri, whether in terms of India's support for countries like Sri Lanka, whether India's commitment to climate change. And I think the wider issue that continued to resonate throughout his speech and throughout his outreach, broader outreach at the UN General Assembly, was that, look, India is doing this on India's terms, that India is certainly proactive, but India is active because India has a certain idea of what its aspirations are, and India wants to project those aspirations on the global stage. So I think at both ends of the spectrum, you saw India making a very, very robust case for its centrality in global governance architecture today. And on the other, there is a great degree of receptivity, which you were mentioning. Where it was Mr. Biden also talking about India in his speech, Macron, of course, talking about it, Lavrov talking about it, and in some ways, a number of other smaller countries also mentioning India's role, underscoring India's growing profile in terms of the broader issues of global governance. And so when when Ukraine war started, no one really thought that India would be central to a lot of these conversations. But today, and what you saw at the UN General Assembly, was that India's positioning, India's diplomatic posture is very keenly observed, and it sends out different messages to different actors at critical junctures. And I think that's what was important in terms of the interventions that we saw. And India, again, making a case that India stands for peace, for diplomatic dialogue, and for a broader respect for UN Charter and international law when it comes to the Ukraine crisis as well. So I think all in all, Dr. Jaishankar's outreach at the UN General Assembly was about making a robust case for India, making India's aspirations very clear, and also making it very clear, perhaps in his other engagements like Quad, BRICS, IPSA, India, Latin American, consortium. All of these very, very interesting engagements that also tell us the changing nature of global multilateral order today, when minilateralism is being preferred, where the idea is that if the UN doesn't work, then global governance doesn't stop. We need to keep working with like-minded countries, trying to find solutions to global problems where we can. And India continues to project itself as a key member of those conversations. And there is a great receptivity to the role, for a larger role for India when it comes to these conversations. So I think Dr. Jaishankar's approach and outreach at the UN in New York was largely about projecting a self-confident India on the global stage and making a case for India's centrality in these global governance conversations.
And of course, it seemed that he was very successful in presenting his case, and India. He also reiterated that India is engaging with the world on its own terms now and from a position of strength. But how is India's growing profile in the global order and India's diplomatic posturing now, the way it's posturing itself, defining its relationship, for example, with the United States? What changes do you see? Our foreign minister did mention very clearly or pointed out or called out rather Biden administration's policies on the sale of F-16 to Pakistan, and saying that this relationship has not really helped either of the countries. But at the same time, it talks about India and the US, the relationship being very, very bullish.
Yes, and I think that's perhaps the real story of Indo-US relations today. That we have our own challenges, we have our own differences. Washington looks at India's role with regard to the Ukraine crisis differently than India does. And India looks at America's involvement with Pakistan and regional security through a different lens. But I think what has happened is perhaps a significant sign of maturity, that both countries are now very comfortable in airing those differences openly, making it clear that yes, there are differences on certain issues that need to be accounted for, as in the case of F-16 sale to Pakistan, which Indian Foreign Minister was categorical in suggesting, and that look, this is not a problem of F-16. This is a problem of American foreign policy that has over the years nurtured Pakistani foreign policy priorities in a way that has not helped Pakistan. So I think he was making a broader point than simply about the sale of this, a particular weapon system. And that's, I think, the real concern that has always been there in India, that America continues to look at its short-term interests in Pakistan at the cost of the perhaps long-term sustainability of Pakistan as a credible anchor in South Asia. And I think Dr. Jaishankar has been very categorical on that. And despite that, and despite American sensitivities on Ukraine, we have seen the engagement actually growing. Engagement has not really suffered on account of these differences. If you saw Dr. Jaishankar's itinerary, it reflected the breadth of the relationship. There are civil society actors, India, corporate sector in the US, you have science and technology sector, all these sectors where which tells you a story that India-US relationship is driven more than just by their governments. Governments have almost become incidental to the relationship. There are so many other vectors, so many other variables that are pushing this relationship in a direction that has and that has given a new momentum to this relationship, and that momentum continues to be on autopilot. There is a certain sense that yes, leaderships are invested, but beyond that, there is a larger constellation of constituencies that are invested in this relationship, and therefore the relationship will continue to grow. And therefore, what you mentioned, both sides remain very bullish on this relationship.
Absolutely. Both the sides remain very bullish on this relationship, despite the fact that there are differences on many issues, but it continues to move forward. Another issue that I would like to take up today is India and China, and how do you see the relationship there? We had a very interesting case where, China is kind of, Chinese ambassador is saying that relationship has moved forward and we are moving towards normalcy. And he claims that the situation at LSE is now more or less normal, and the two sides have agreed. And we know that the two sides have agreed to disengage on at the LSE on few points, which were friction points. But earlier, the Indian Army chief, from what he said, it seems like there are, I mean, the friction points remain, and he never pointed out about the relationship moving towards normalizations. So, do you see a contradiction there?
Well, yes, I think for both sides there are incentives to continue along the present trajectory. I think the Chinese side desperately wants some kind of restoration of uh, peace and tranquility along the border. They want some semblance of normalcy along the border, and an acknowledgement, perhaps in New Delhi, that things are becoming normal. And India, rightfully, is reluctant to acknowledge that. And I think this is Indian Army Chief made his views very clear. But even Dr. Jaishankar made his views very clear when he said that, look, ultimately, it's a question of the boundary issue. Shaping the larger contours of Sino-Indian relationship. So unless we have a substantial progress on the boundary issue, I don't think the Sino-Indian relations could become normal. I think that was his assessment, and the assessment, as you were mentioning, from the Chinese ambassador here has been that, look, things are becoming normal. So I think both sides want to project their own priorities on this process. Chinese have a certain urgency in making a case that, look, things are becoming normal. We are reducing friction points, and perhaps we can go back to pre-April 2020 diplomatic engagements. And India is very reluctant to do that, rightfully so. And I don't think we are going to see any broader rapprochement happening anytime soon, because for India also this is a time when it has some momentum on its side, when it has been able to stand up to China. It has been able to give China a message that, look, we can stand up to you. It's not just because you are a militarily, economically superior power doesn't mean that you will get all the objectives that you have in mind vis-a-vis India. Indian Army, Indian policy is very capable of standing up to China, and that's what we have done since 2020. And that means that for China, given that China is surrounded by multiple pressures, given that internal pressures are mounting, given that China is moving into a very critical re-election phase or renomination phase of Xi Jinping, this is an important timeline for China, and China would like to project some sense of normalcy with India. And India is not willing to give in just yet the satisfaction that perhaps China is demanding. So I think we are going to continue to see this volatility for a while.
Yeah. And how do you see India's role, or what was India's role in engaging with other, or working very closely with the other IAEA members for actually, China had to withdraw a draft resolution against AUKUS at the IAEA. So what exactly has been India's role there?
I think India's role was very important because India could mobilize a number of countries that were, that do not see themselves as part of either camp. And AUKUS, because you have Australia, US, and UK, three key traditional allies of each other, and they had declared this partnership as one to provide to build submarines and to provide submarines to Australia. This was China was trying to make a case that, look, this is in contravention of their NPT commitments. And India, I think, for both pragmatic and for ideological reasons, decided to push back. I think pragmatic because China has been such a nuisance as far as India is concerned when it comes to multilateral fora. We have seen China not relenting even on issues like terrorism. So there is no real, need for India to be on China's side when it comes to these platforms. And I think here there was an opportunity for India to also make a broader point that India does not see AUKUS as problematic in the Indo-Pacific. India's views are different. India sees AUKUS as an effort by like-minded countries to create a semblance of balance in a region that is increasingly getting dominated by China. So if you recall, when AUKUS was announced, India did not make any noises about it. India was calm and confident that it contributes to broader stability. India has all three, Australia, US, and UK, are close partners of India in the Indo-Pacific. There is no real need for India to make a common cause with China, which is clearly driven by Chinese security strategy. That China does not want countries in the region to emerge as security guarantors in their own right. China wants to dominate the Indo-Pacific militarily, especially the seas, and I think for India, supporting like-minded countries in pushing back is something that India feels strongly about. Also, ideologically, the case that China was making is relatively weak. That this is against the NPT commitments, and India, which has always been a strong votary of nuclear disarmament, and China, in fact, a country that has done more damage to the nuclear non-proliferation order than any other country, than any other major power, than any other P5 power, certainly has no locus standi to talk about legal aspects of this problem. And India therefore pushed back and got the outcome that perhaps India and its partners wanted.
Yeah, China had to withdraw a draft resolution against AUKUS at IAEA. Of course, we know that the AUKUS alliance is seen as a response to a very aggressive China or Chinese behavior across the Indo-Pacific. So India clearly not standing there with China and did not need to stand with China, but was rather with other like-minded countries in pushing back Chinese aggression, as you pointed out. Before we end this episode, I would like to have an analysis from you on a very important thing that just happened yesterday, that the Russians have claimed that they have finally been able to gain control of those four, they have been able to annex those four regions which were earlier partially seized probably by the Russians since this conflict started. And there has been a big ceremony and a celebration in Russia. And how does this impact the situation between Russia and Ukraine now?
I think we are entering some very dangerous territory here because Russia clearly, is visibly losing. And we have just had reports in the last few hours, in the last 24 hours, that another important town, Lyman, for example, has been taken away from Russia. Russia has withdrawn its forces from that very strategically important town. And this town becomes very critical when you look at the Donetsk region in Ukraine, which the Russians have claimed as having been annexed. Now the problem there is that what I think Russians are trying to do is, because they are facing some severe battlefield losses, they are trying to focus more and more on territories that they have been able to gain easily, and therefore strengthen their control over these territories. And by annexation, Russians are trying to make a case that, look, any attack on these territories now would lead to some major repercussions or some major response by Russia. And we have in fact seen, in the case of Lyman, for example, one of Putin's closest allies again talking of battlefield nuclear weapons. That I think the danger here is that the Russians facing or feeling cornered are now really talking about nuclear weapons more openly than they have ever done so. We have seen in the last 2 weeks lots of statements coming out. This is an escalation ladder that Russians feel they can climb. They want to focus on battlefield tactical nuclear weapons, and I think those dangers are becoming very visible. And I think the Western countries are also looking very, very carefully at what this might mean in terms of operational realities, if at all a battlefield nuclear device is used, in and around Ukraine. So I think the crisis is only going to become deeper, unfortunately. And despite international community by and large telling Mr. Putin to rethink, he does not seem to have any intention of doing so. In fact, he seems to be doubling down on making a case that at least those territories which you mentioned that have been under Russian control for some time are now finally deemed to be Russian territories, which of course the rest of the world has not yet recognized.
Yes, of course. And there was a ceremony in Moscow. But, like you said, we're entering into a very dangerous situation and the war is further escalating. The UN chief has called it escalation. But what do we understand? A final question on China and India abstaining on condemning Russia on this.
I think they continue to make a case that to Russia privately, and in fact, Mr. Modi did it publicly at the SCO. But I think they are not. India, in particular, does not see its role as one where it will use an international platform as part of a certain group of
Sure.
countries to work against Russia, and therefore you see that balancing act continuing, where in private, in one-on-one conversations, India making its case very clear. In fact, Dr. Jaishankar's statements on the nuclear threats that are coming from Russia are also very, very categorical and clear. But it's when it comes to India taking the Western position on this issue, that's, I think, it still remains a big no-no.
Absolutely, India's effort to balance continues there, and India has been pointing this out that India is not on the side of war privately, but continues to not condemn it on public platforms along with a group of certain other countries, like you said. But we are entering a very dangerous situation there. It's been called as and is looked upon as an escalation. Thank you so much for that analysis, Harsh. That's all that we have time for on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Thank you for joining us.